Kackiest Kacky is an event in Trackmania where players try to finish as many new Kacky maps as possible over the span of a month. These maps are not for the faint of heart and are famously known to be some of the hardest in the game, taking even the top players hundreds of hours to complete. Creators of these maps will showcase game bugs and mechanics in creative and entertaining ways, and will put a huge amount of time and thought into creating these masterpieces, usually with a very specific vision for how they should be played. When players find alternative, easier ways to complete them, it's called a cheese. And while some players enjoy discovering new cheeses to make the maps easier to finish, it can be pretty frustrating for the mappers who put in so much effort to build them. During the most recent edition of Kacky Reloaded, which is the Kacky event specifically hosted in TM 2020, 17 cheeses were found, which means 1 in every 5 maps in the event were ruined by cheeses. This caused a lot of frustration in the community, not only from the mappers, but also from the players, who were looking forward to creative and exciting maps, and instead got a map pack filled with boring and repetitive cheese strats. To prevent this from happening again in Kackiest Kacky 8, the very latest Kacky edition, this time hosted in TMNF, the organizers of Kacky put together a team of players tasked with one mission: to review the maps before the event started and find and fix as many cheeses as possible so that the players could finally enjoy the maps as they were intended to be played. This team was called the Cheese Police. These 7 players single-handedly found and prevented over 50 cheeses and alternate strats from making it into the Kackiest Kacky 8 map pack. I would like to show you these runs, starting off with a crazy strat found by Storm on the map -151. For future reference, the 50 Kackiest Kacky 8 maps are labeled from the number -151 through to -200. Back to Storm's alt strat on -151, he found that instead of doing the intended route, there was a chance a player could get a Uber bug that sent them straight into the finish. While this would be significantly harder to pull off, it had the potential to be much faster, so the mapper blocked this off by adding a few walls. The next cheese is actually a bit of a fail for the Cheese Police. About halfway into the event itself, I was working on a tool-assisted speedrun of -152 and stumbled across this cut, where instead of landing on the wire, I could instead bump into it, sending the car directly into the quarter pipe, which is much faster than intended and only a bit harder. Simo, the mapper of -152, was able to achieve the second fastest time on the map with this strat. On -153, the goal is to Uber backwards over a wall. Kia found that with a precise flip off the ramp, he could bounce off the roof of his car and fly over the wall, completely avoiding Ubering at all. This was prevented by removing the scenery that was used to bounce off of. Another interesting story involving -153 is that during the very first playthrough of all the Kackiest Kacky 8 maps by the community, a player named Vogtech was able to Uber off the opposite side of the road and just barely make it over the wall. This is not the intended way of finishing the track, and multiple Cheese Police members warned about this being a possibility, but it wasn't fixed due to it being considered way harder than the intended Uber. To this day, the very first finisher of the map is the one and only player to finish by using the left wall. -154 is a great example of something that we're going to see a lot in the Cheese Police's findings: the stadium cut. As you can see, every track in the game is surrounded by these large structures called the stadium. Players found that you can climb up the stadium using a series of fairly consistent tricks. Once on top of the stadium roof, you have plenty of space to gather speed before jumping back into the play area. This gives players the opportunity to jump to places that mappers never intended them to be able to get to without first driving the map normally. Kia was able to take full advantage of this on -154. First, he jumped into the water, drove to the edge of the pool, and climbed out. He then gathered speed by driving around the stadium before hitting the backside of a sign bouncing up to the player just below the stadium roof. Then, he drove around to the outside, gathered more speed, and then used the conveniently ramp-shaped structure to jump onto the stadium roof. From here, he was able to gather as much speed as he could and then jump off the roof, bouncing on the water and landing perfectly on the finish. This process of climbing up to the stadium roof and then jumping off will be seen many more times throughout this video. The mappers fixed this issue in 2 ways. First, they added a wall, blocking off the angle from the water bounce, and second, they completely removed the water physics in the bounce area, just to be safe. -155 is another good example of a common mistake that the Cheese Police were able to take advantage of: not being careful with map scenery. Although scenery can add a huge amount of value to a map, it can also open up new possibilities often overlooked by the mappers. Here, Book was able to take advantage of a poorly placed water pool, taking speed and then using the pool border to bounce up to the finishes. Kia was able to use the same water pool to bounce up, this time driving around the stadium and hitting a small ledge to bounce towards the pool. Another route found by Kia was a tricky stadium cut where you would jump off the roof and land back at the start area. From here, Edge found that you could take speed and jump off the road to the left, bouncing on some scenery into the finish area. The mapper was able to fix these cheeses by first replacing the pool with another large structure and by blocking off Edge's end jump, making the entire stadium cut route useless. While the Cheese Police didn't find any major issues on -156, Edge was able to find this super interesting route that I thought was worth sharing, even though it's probably impossible for humans due to its difficulty. This is the route he theorized. First, he did the start of the map as intended, slowing down as he jumped through the ring. He then drove around to the outer scenery and went to a specific spot on the outer wall, before hitting it in a way that allowed him to drop down, hooking one wheel into the dirt. While in this position, it is possible to rock back and forth and control your direction of travel. He slowly worked his way over to this section and then maneuvered into the passageway. Then, he hit the wall in a precise way to bug down through the dirt, landing on this blue road. With a small recovery, he was able to make it to the slanted platform, and once there, the map was all but completed. Just hit the wall to jump up to the road and then drive into the finish. Although there was no real risk of anyone ever finishing the map in this way, the mapper still fixed it by rearranging some of the blocks underneath the finish. Due to an oversight by the mapper, -158 had an incredibly simple cheese found by Book. After driving most of the map as intended, instead of turtling to the finish, Book instead dropped down onto the platform and took as much speed as possible to just jump to the bug fin. This was a quick and easy fix by replacing a bit of the scenery. -159 didn't have any huge issues, but while trying to find the intended route on the map, I stumbled upon a strat where I bounced on the outside of the finish triangle to keep speed and continue with the track. Although this was just as hard as the intended way, if not harder, the mapper still decided to block it off with some extra scenery. Another small cheese found on this map was at the ending, and this time it was not found by the Cheese Police. During the event, the player F6 found that after reaching the final platform, you could use all the space possible and take speed to grab the final checkpoint. This is a super simple cheese and definitely should have been found by the Cheese Police, but the mapper said they didn't really mind, as making it to that platform to begin with was the hard part anyway. On -162, Storm found that after reaching the checkpoint at the end of the map, it is possible to respawn and drop down to the finishes. Failing the end of this map and needing to respawn is incredibly rare, so the mapper didn't think it was worth fixing, but I still thought it was good to show, as some players might not know that this is possible in the final version. -164 was a challenging map to get completely cheese-proofed. I was the first to find an alternate route here, by first grabbing the ring checkpoint as intended, then respawning, bugging up through the road, going back to the start, and then using a ramp to jump up to some of the scenery. From here, I could jump down to the end section, go to the start of the boosters, and then do the end as intended. This was fixed by slightly changing the scenery so that there wasn't space to gather speed to jump to the boosters. Book then found a second reroute where he used the first ramp to jump up to the ring checkpoint area, gather speed, and then grab the checkpoint. He then respawned back to the start, grabbed the road checkpoint, and went back to the start one last time before using the same ramp to take advantage of the now moved blue wall and jump directly to the end boosters. He then also did the end as intended. The mapper prevented this route by finally completely blocking off those pesky ramps. Delete Club then noticed that if you fail the end grass slide, you could just drop back down to the boosters and retry the end. The mapper attempted to fix this by using pools to add an invisible floor between the two layers, but unfortunately missed a single block while building, and it was never found by the Cheese Police. The player Hugo was the first to take advantage of this, and many players since have successfully completed the track by retrying the end. On -165, Helvete noted that it might be possible to use this small ledge to push the front wheels up and continue the map. Although this never ended up getting fixed, only one player that I know of was able to complete the map in this way. -166 didn't have any cheeses found by the Cheese Police, but Storm found that it's technically possible to do the start of the map by going backwards. This is significantly harder than the intended strat, so it wasn't removed, but it is cool nonetheless, so I figured I would show it anyway. Another map in which scenery caused some issues was -167. Kia was able to use another stadium cut to jump out towards the finishes, and with a precise bounce on a pipe used for decoration, could bounce into the finish. This was fixed by slightly rearranging the pipes in a way that prevented any bounces from being possible. Minus 169 had another crazy strat theorized by Edge, where you would take speed around the play area and use a pool border to get into the position to do a nose bug to the finish. Although this was never proven to be possible, the mapper still went ahead and blocked it off by adding a structure around the outside of the pool. Another pretty simple oversight by the mapper was on minus 170, where I found that instead of sliding along the spectator block to get to the booster with speed, you could just clip the edge of the scenery and continue with much more speed than you could ever achieve with the intended way. This was a pretty easy fix. All the mappers had to do was add a sign to block off the cut. I also found that you can spin around and do the end backwards, but the mapper thought that this was cool and didn't mind that it was possible, so it was never fixed. On minus 171, Edge noted that once on the final road, it was basically a guaranteed finish, even if you didn't land with speed. You could just roll up to the top and would be able to gather enough speed to reach the finish. The mapper acknowledged this, but felt that the end was never supposed to be the hard part, so it was never fixed. Players like Acer have been able to take advantage of this in similar ways since. On minus 175, yet another stadium cut was found by Kia. He jumped out onto a road that was part of the scenery before dropping down to the finish. This was fixed by simply removing the road piece entirely. An interesting alternate route was found by Edge and Storm. Edge found that by using the scenery, he could bounce to the spectator block, drive around the edge of it to gather speed, and then drop back down onto the track with a decent amount of speed. However, this speed was not enough to finish the map the intended way, which is where Storm came in. He found that by flipping off the ramp and using a slanted platform block in the scenery, he could grass slide up to the finish, requiring much less speed than the intended way, and being a perfect end to Edge's start cheese. This route was fixed by, again, simply removing the slanted platform block, rendering the entire route useless. Minus 176 was another map that proved to be very difficult to cheese-proof. The first cheese was found by Helvete, where instead of doing the end as intended, he jumped out of the quarter pipe early, landing on the scenery roof and easily rolling down to the finish. This was fixed by adding a wall to the side of the quarter pipe, preventing players from jumping out early. After this, I found that you don't actually need to jump out early to land on that roof, and was able to simply jump directly there, avoiding the new wall. The mapper then fully blocked off the roof with a wall of signs. Helvete went on to theorize that it might be possible to grab the first ring checkpoint, respawn, and then use the inflatable block to go to the end, making the map respawnable, which wasn't intended. Although this was never proved to be possible, the mapper went ahead and fixed it anyway by lowering the height of the block. The fourth cheese on minus 176 was found by Edge. He realized that instead of riding the wall at the end, you could just land on your wheels and roll to the finish. This was never fixed, and it is still possible on the final version of the map. Finally, during the event, the player Plasterex was able to completely jump over the intended landing spot for the end, instead landing on the top of the wall, completely skipping the end of the map. Storm warned that this might be possible before the event started, but it was never fixed, resulting in a super fast way to skip the end of the map being in the final version. It is important to note that the mapper of minus 176 is famously known to never use block mix on his Kacky maps, which allows mappers to overlap blocks by using external tools. Not using block mix makes mapping, especially Kacky mapping, much more difficult, as possibilities are much more limited due to not being able to overlap blocks. Minus 177 had a cheese theorized by Helvete where he would drop down onto the scenery and then jump down into the backside of the quarter pipe. From here, he thought that it might be possible to bug through the quarter pipe down into the finish area. Although this was never proven possible, it was still fixed by blocking off the landing area in the scenery. While looking for cheeses, I looked at taking speed on the final grass slide platform and then using an edge bug to reach the finish. I ultimately decided that it was impossible for humans, as it was just barely out of reach. Underestimating the Kacky community was one of the biggest mistakes I could have made, and after the player F6 was the first to prove me wrong, at least 25 people have finished the map using this cheese since, making it the worst cheese police oversight this edition by far. Thankfully, I was able to redeem myself a bit on minus 179. I found that after doing the start as intended and collecting the first ring checkpoint, I could respawn and by pressing nothing but the forward key, bounce over the freewheel block by using the hole in the road. Then, with a simple drop into the sculpture, I could cruise into the finish. This was fixed in two ways. First, the mappers turned around the booster, so that bouncing using the hole was now impossible. And second, they removed the second ring checkpoint, meaning that even if someone did manage to make it to that platform, the freewheel effect wouldn't be removed, and the player would have much less speed for the ending, making it impossible. Minus 181 is an interesting one. While looking for cheeses, Book stumbled across an interesting bug, where he could hit the backside of these blocks, and for some reason it bugged him down. This was thought to be useless until Edge came along and found that by climbing with the scenery sculptures, he could climb to the area where Book found the bug. They could then bug down directly onto the finish, making for a really unique and interesting cheese. This was fixed by completely removing the platform section behind the track. Minus 182 was another really difficult map to cheese-proof. The first cheese was found by Delete Club when he noticed a vulnerability in the scenery above the finish. He realized that if he took speed and used a pool border to jump and bounce up to the area above the finish, he could use a poorly placed spectator block to bug down through the roof of the finish area and then drive into the finish. This was fixed by slightly changing up the scenery. Another cheese was found by Book, who took advantage of a pool placed around the map. He saw that he could take speed and use the pool border to jump over the wall, flying into the finish. Kia found a similar strat using a different pool, and this one consistently puts you in a position to do a nose bug towards the finish, making it even easier than Book's version. Finally, Edge found the fourth and final cheese on this map, using a bit of the pool border as well as the foot of the sculpture to bounce over the wall and into the finish. These cheeses were all fixed by removing the pools and replacing the sculpture, leaving the map cheese-proof. Minus 185 had a cheese theorized by Storm where instead of riding the wall as intended, he would just bounce off of it into the finish. Although this was never proven possible, the mappers still added a pillar to block this line off. Kia also found that a stadium cut is possible, but due to how precise it is, it was never removed from the map. Another interesting map for cheeses was minus 186. For a while, this map's intended route was a complete mystery for the cheese police. I found that if someone was able to make it to the end area on their wheels, they could use the edge of the hole to drop down into the quarter pipe and finish the track as intended, but I had no clue how to actually get there in the first place. With a little help from Storm, we were able to find that by using these tiny black dots on the wall near the start, we could bounce up onto the scenery, take speed on the blue wall, and use the edge to bounce up to a higher layer of scenery. From here, we could drop down onto the end area and finish the run with my end cheese. The mapper prevented this by putting a small antenna at the end of the blue wall, completely blocking it off and preventing the ability to use it to get to the upper layer. A second cheese was found by multiple players, starting with Kia, who found that it is possible to get a tiny bonk on the sculpture to get a setup for a powerful grass slide over to the quarter pipe. Storm then found that if he landed in the quarter pipe with speed, he could use the scenery to jump over to the same area that the previous cheese got to by using the small black piece on the wall. From here, Helvete saw that by using a piece of road in the scenery, he could drive on the edge, gather speed, and jump up to the upper layer. Once this was done, all they had to do was use my end cheese to finish the track. This route was prevented by completely blocking off the jump down to the end area, making the entire route useless. On minus 187, Book theorized that it might be possible to edge bug and use the left wall to bounce over the opposite wall, flying directly into the finish. This was never proven to be possible, but because it had the potential of being much faster than the intended route, the mapper added an extra wall to block it off. Minus 188 didn't have any huge cheeses, but I was able to find a cut that ended up being fast enough that it was worth fixing. Instead of doing the backward spider, I instead just bounced directly through the gap, finishing about a second faster than intended, with the potential for much more. To fix this, the mapper added palm trees to the freewheel block, as well as extended the rounded wall, completely blocking the cutoff. On minus 191, Helvete found that instead of doing the intended start, he could drive around the scenery, climb onto the road, avoiding the freewheels, and by gathering speed, he would have enough to make it to the end. He also found that if a player landed in a way which lost them speed, they could simply use the quarter pipe to gather enough speed to jump to the finish. To fix this, the mapper completely redid the second half of the map, adding a larger speed check to the middle section and a harder end as well. The League Club also found that if he took speed around the stadium and used a fence to jump back into the map, he could land with enough speed to complete it. After these fences were blocked off with scenery, the map was considered cheese-proof. Minus 192. Where do I begin? This was by far the most cheese map of the bunch, and Delete Club was the first to find a cheese. He was able to use the ramps on the ground used as scenery to jump back onto the road, skipping the entire first half of the map. This was easily resolved by replacing the ramps with a different decor. Then, Book found that by simply gathering some speed on the start road, you could drop down onto the freewheels and would have enough speed to make it to the end. By adding a wall to the start, this was blocked off. After this, Kia found 3 different stadium cuts that were all very viable to use. He first found that you could just jump directly onto the road and land in the same place that Delete Club landed in his cheese. He also theorized that it might be possible to skip the freewheel by using a trick known as the Wasker trick, but because of the grass checkpoint placed inside the freewheel block, this seems to be impossible. In the next stadium cut, Kia waited to jump off the roof until a bit further down, and then landed on the road with enough speed to roll all the way to the end. In a similar way, Kia found one more spot where he could exit the roof, landing on the road similar as before, and finishing in the same way. All 3 of these stadium cuts were prevented with different inflatable structures and walls. The next cheese was also found by Kia. He found that if he climbed the wall at the start, used a pipe to drop down to the area underneath, and then used that area to gather speed, he would have enough speed to reach the end. This was prevented by completely blocking off the section below the start. The seventh and final cheese on -192 was found by Edge, when he remembered that while freewheeling, if the car is driven up against a wall at a specific angle, it will slowly move forward, even while freewheeling. This meant that as long as he made it up the hill, he could make it to the end every time. This was prevented by adding diagonal walls on both sides of the checkpoint, making this map cheese-proof. -194 was another troublesome map. Delete Club found the most important cheese pretty early on, when he realized that by driving on the very edges to skip the anti-boosters, he could gather enough speed to reach the finish without driving backwards. This meant that if in any way a player made it to the final road, they could finish. Delete Club found that you could get there by gathering speed on the middle road, and Kia used a small ledge around the stadium to get to the same place. However, once this was fixed by adding a choke point to the road, this rendered all of these strats useless. After this, I found that by doing a small drift on the final jump, I could just turn around in the air instead of using the wall, making it much less precise. This was fixed by replacing the pole with a hole. Additionally, Delete Club found an interesting stadium cut where he turned around mid-air to land backwards and keep enough speed to the finish. After the inflatable structure was extended to block this angle, the map was considered to be cheese-proof. However, during the event, there were multiple other strats found for the end. One where a player called Scrappy used the edge of the hole to turn around, and another where Power turned around using a ram bug at the jump. Yet another stadium cut was found on -195, this time by Book. This was a pretty simple stadium cut and a pretty simple fix. By adding some walls, this was successfully blocked off. On -196, the player is supposed to do a wicked turnaround to land on the road with speed, but Edge found that he could actually skip the turnaround entirely and just land on the road. By shortening the turnaround area to one block, this was prevented. Delete Club warned that if someone managed to grab both checkpoints and fail the end, they could climb out of the water pool, form a stadium climb, jump out towards the track, and bounce on the water to finish the map. Although this scenario was quite unlikely, the mapper still went ahead and removed the water physics in that area, making the save impossible. -197 had a cheese found by Kia, where instead of flipping as intended, he just drove straight, bouncing on the car's spoiler to avoid the freewheel, and then continuing the map as normal. This was fixed by adding some ledges that were just high enough to prevent bouncing over. On the original -198, Edge found that it was possible to respawn after the first checkpoint, and after gathering some speed, it was possible to jump down into the next wall ride and keep just enough speed to continue the track as normal. Respawning is almost always preferably avoidable, so the mapper went ahead and added an antenna as well as an invisible box using pools to block this cheese off. The final cheese of the video belongs to Book on -199. He realized that he was able to skip the entirety of the map by traveling down the hill and then just driving into the bottom road. This would cause him to bug through the road, allowing him to finish the map. The mapper fixed this by completely redoing the end, removing the road piece and instead using a freewheel block to prevent players from driving to the finish. In total, the Cheese Police found 58 cheeses and alternate strats, with Kia being the clear MVP this time around. Without the immense effort of these players, Kackiest Kacky 8 would have almost certainly been plagued by cheeses, as the editions before it were. I hope this video can bring some much deserved attention to these players' game knowledge, skill, and attention to detail, and I hope it can also help out future mappers who are trying to avoid having their maps cheesed. Thanks for watching, see ya.